Edward Callahan saw the hand pounding on the window of the car, buried in snow, and knew that if he didn't land now, whoever was inside would freeze to death within hours. If you enjoy true stories of survival, family drama, and second chances, hit the like button now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of this emotional story. And comment below, would you forgive someone after 7 years of silence? Let's go. Loneliness had a sound of its own when flying solo over Alaska. Edward knew that sound by heart. The constant hum of the Cessna 206's engine, the sharp whistle of wind against the metal wings, and that dense, profound silence that existed only 10,000 feet above ground, where the world below seemed far too small to contain all the regrets of a lifetime. At 71, Edward had learned not only to tolerate that silence, but to embrace it as an old companion. It was better than human voices, better than persistent memories, better, above all, than the hollow echo of the hallways of the mansion waiting for him in the Chugach Mountains, where he would spend yet another winter completely alone, just as he had every winter since Eleanor was gone. The blizzard had begun 3 days earlier, descending on Alaska with the pent-up fury of decades. Meteorologists called it a historic storm, a once-in-a-century event, a slow-motion catastrophe. State authorities in Anchorage issued red alerts, urging absolutely no one to leave home under any circumstances. City schools were closed indefinitely. Ted Stevens International Airport suspended all commercial flights. Entire highways were shut down. Shelter in place, the official orders said. But Edward Callahan had never been a man to follow anyone's orders. He had built an empire in the oil and natural gas sector precisely by ignoring what others said was impossible. He had his own airplane, maintained in impeccable condition, his own private airstrip, enough financial resources to live 3 entire lifetimes without working a single day. And if he wanted to fly in the middle of the worst blizzard in decades, he simply would. He had departed from Fairbanks that frigid February morning, taking advantage of a brief window of partly clear skies that weather models predicted would last at most 4 hours. Now, nearly 2.5 hours later, flying over the state's wild interior, the sky was closing in again. Heavy clouds, dark and dense as molten lead, advanced from west to east like an implacable celestial army. Edward adjusted the controls with the steady hands of someone who had been flying for over 40 years, keeping the plane level as he gradually descended over the small town of Talkeetna, a tiny, almost invisible speck, lost in Alaska's vast frozen wilderness. About 120 miles north of Anchorage. Below, the streets were completely deserted. Thin columns of grayish smoke rose lazily from the chimneys of the few wooden houses, bravely resisting the brutal cold. The George Parks Highway, the main road snaking north toward Denali, was entirely buried beneath an uneven, thick layer of snow that Edward estimated to be easily 3 or 4 feet deep in some places. No cars moved, no visible human activity, no sign of life other than the chimney smoke. Only the infinite, relentless, and silent white that covered everything like a frozen shroud. Edward was about to look away and focus on the final route to his property when something sudden and unexpected caught his peripheral vision. A car, standing alone on the roadside, almost completely swallowed and buried by accumulated snow. Only a small portion of the roof and part of the rear windshield remained visible above the white line. No human footprints around the vehicle, no sign of recent activity. No trail suggesting anyone had walked away. Yet something deeply disturbing lingered in that frozen scene. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. How long had that car been abandoned there? Hours? A full day? Several days? He tilted the plane gently to the left, dropping a few meters in altitude to get a better look. The strong wind shook the fuselage violently. Edward compensated automatically, gripping the controls harder. His seasoned eyes scanned the terrain below methodically. The road stretched completely empty in both directions as far as he could see. The car truly looked abandoned, perhaps left behind by someone who had managed to hitch a ride to safety. But then, through the windshield, partially covered in ice and compacted snow, Edward saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Movement. A faint, almost imperceptible motion. A human hand, pounding desperately yet weakly against the inside glass. Edward's heart exploded into rapid beats. Someone was alive in there. Someone who had likely been trapped for hours or days, trying to survive the deadly cold, waiting for a rescue that might never come. Without allowing himself a single second of hesitation, Edward began immediately assessing options for an emergency landing. The highway was relatively wide at that particular stretch, maybe wide enough for the Cessna's wingspan, but it was dangerously covered with uneven snow, likely with layers of ice beneath. Risky. Extremely risky. One miscalculation, and he could flip the plane, destroy it completely, and become yet another casualty of the storm. But the hand kept pounding weakly on the glass. Edward descended further, now flying barely 500 feet above the ground. Fighting crosswinds that tried to push the plane off course, he studied the road surface with surgical intensity. There, about 200 meters ahead of the trapped car, was a section that seemed marginally flatter, where the wind had apparently swept away some of the snow, revealing dark patches of asphalt. It could work. It had to work. Edward made one low pass first. inspecting the terrain one last time. Satisfied enough with what he saw, he gained altitude again, positioning the plane for final approach. His hands moved with automatic precision, the product of decades of experience. He gradually reduced engine power, lowered the flaps fully, adjusted the trim, and aligned the nose of the plane with the partially exposed asphalt strip. The wind tried to shove him sideways. Edward compensated. The altimeter dropped quickly. 500 feet, 400, 300. The snow-covered trees on both sides of the highway seemed to close in menacingly. 200, 100. The Cessna hit the surface with a rougher impact than Edward expected. The wheels skidded sideways on the ice hidden beneath the thin snow layer. Edward pressed the brakes gently, not wanting to lock the wheels and lose control completely. The plane slid forward, seeming it would never stop. And then, finally, it did. Edward released a long, trembling breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers ached from gripping the yoke. He shut off the engine, grabbed his heavy winter jacket from the back seat, opened the door, and was instantly struck by a solid wall of cutting cold that sliced through his clothes like icy knives. The temperature was easily below -20 Fahrenheit. The wind howled like a living, furious creature. Edward pulled the hood over his head and began trudging with difficulty through the deep snow toward the buried car, each step demanding immense effort. It took him nearly 5 minutes to cover the 200 meters. When he finally reached the vehicle, an old dark blue Toyota Camry sedan, Edward began frantically digging the packed snow away from the driver's door with his gloved hands. His lungs burned from the freezing air. His muscles screamed in protest. Finally, he managed to pry the door open, and his entire world froze, because inside, huddled in the driver's seat with blue lips and a violently trembling body, was a young man in his 20s. A young man Edward recognized instantly, despite the 7 years of absence. The unshaven face and the gaunt cheeks. Daniel, his grandson. Daniel. And in Daniel's shaking arms, wrapped in layers upon layers of improvised blankets, coats, and jackets, was a tiny baby. Edward stood literally paralyzed for an eternal moment, unable to process what his eyes saw. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination from the cold, the altitude, or his old mind finally surrendering to senility. But then, Daniel slowly opened his eyes, with immense effort, and their gazes met. Recognition flashed across that frozen face, and with a voice so weak it was almost a whisper, broken by cold and despair, Daniel said only one word. "Grandpa." Edward felt his knees weaken. 7 years. 7 whole years since he had last heard that voice call him that. 7 years since the terrible argument about inheritance, about money, about Eleanor, and the will. 7 years since Daniel had stormed out of the mansion, shouting that he never wanted to see his grandfather again, that Edward cared more about money than family, that he was a bitter, cruel old man. 7 years of absolute silence. And now, here he was, freezing to death on a deserted roadside in the middle of the worst blizzard of the century. "Daniel," Edward finally managed to say, his voice hoarse and strange. "What the hell are you doing here? What happened?" Daniel tried to respond, but his teeth chattered so violently that the words came out unintelligible. He clutched the baby tighter against his chest, as if protecting the child from some invisible threat. Edward forced himself into action mode. Questions could wait, explanations would come later. Right now, only one thing mattered, getting them out before they froze to death. "Can you walk?" Edward asked sharply. Daniel tried to move his legs, but they clearly didn't respond properly. He shook his head weakly, defeated. "All right, I'll carry you. Hold the baby tight, don't let go. Understand?" Daniel nodded faintly. Despite his age, Edward still had considerable strength in his arms and back from decades working oil fields before becoming an executive. He grabbed Daniel by the arm and pulled him carefully out of the car, then braced him against his own body. "Let's move. Slowly, one step at a time." The walk back to the plane was a never-ending nightmare. Daniel could barely stand, let alone walk. Edward practically dragged him through the snow, the young man stumbling and collapsing every few meters. The baby whimpered softly, a weak, haunting sound that made Edward's stomach twist. When they finally reached the Cessna, Edward opened the rear door and placed Daniel on the seat with all the care he could muster. Daniel still clutched the baby tightly, refusing to let go even for a second. Edward climbed into the front, restarted the engine, waited for it to warm slightly, and then turned the heater to maximum. Warm air began to blow through the vents. Not very hot yet, but better than the deadly cold outside. "We need to get out of here now," Edward said, checking the instruments quickly. "The storm's going to get worse, and I can't fly in this." He didn't wait for a reply. He throttled up, felt the wheels slide again, corrected with the rudder, and the Cessna began rolling along the snow-covered highway. It gained speed, faster, faster. The airspeed indicator climbed 50 knots, 60, 70. Edward gently pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted, the wheels left the ground. They were airborne. Edward made a wide turn northeast toward the Chugach Mountains, where his property lay. The mansion had its own generator, supplies for months, everything they'd need. 40 minutes of flight, maybe 50 with the headwind. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the back seat. Daniel's eyes were closed, his breathing labored but steady. The baby was quiet now, slowly warming up. So many questions screamed in Edward's mind. Whose baby was that? Where was the mother? What had Daniel been doing on that road? Why hadn't he called? Why hadn't he asked for help? But Edward stayed silent. Questions could come later. Now, all that mattered was getting them home. To his home, to safety. The blizzard thickened around the plane. Heavy snowflakes began striking the windshield. Visibility was dropping fast. Edward flew by instruments now, trusting the GPS, compass, and altimeter. The mountains appeared like giant shadows through the white curtain. Edward knew those mountains like the back of his hand. He had flown over them thousands of times. He descended slowly, searching for familiar landmarks. There, the narrow valley, to the right, the rocky cliff, and beyond, the clearing where his private strip lay. The landing was smoother this time. Edward taxied to the small hangar about 50 meters from the main house, shut off the engine, and finally allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. "We're here," he said, turning back. Daniel opened his eyes. Tears rolled silently down his thin, bearded face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I had no one else. Nowhere to go. I didn't know what to do." Edward felt something tighten violently in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, something dangerous and painful. "Let's go inside. We'll talk later." He helped Daniel out of the plane, and together, slowly, they trudged through the snow to the side door of the mansion. Edward entered the code. The door unlocked with a mechanical click, and they finally stepped into the blessed warmth of the house. The mansion was exactly as Daniel must have remembered. Far too large for one person. Too luxurious to be truly cozy. Expensive furniture, artwork on the walls, state-of-the-art technology, but empty. So terribly empty. Edward led Daniel straight to the nearest guest room on the ground floor. He turned on the automatic gas fireplace, grabbed clean blankets from a closet, and helped Daniel lie down on the bed, still holding the baby. "I'll make hot tea. Don't move." In the kitchen, as the water boiled, Edward finally allowed his hands to tremble. He leaned on the marble counter, closed his eyes, and took 3 deep breaths. Daniel was here. His grandson was here, in the house, after 7 years, with a baby, nearly frozen to death on the side of a road. So many questions. But above all, one feeling Edward didn't want to admit, didn't want to feel, yet it exploded in his chest with overwhelming force. Relief? Deep, primal relief that he hadn't arrived too late, that they were alive, that he had a second chance. But a second chance for what, exactly? Edward didn't yet know. He prepared 2 large mugs of strong sweet tea, placed them on a tray along with cookies and a chocolate bar, and returned to the room. Daniel was lying on his side on the bed, still dressed, still holding the baby. His eyes were open now, fixed on the fireplace, watching the flames dance. Edward set the tray on the nightstand. "Drink this. It'll help." Daniel carefully laid the baby on a pile of pillows beside him, making sure she was safe, then took the mug with trembling hands. He sipped in small gulps. Edward pulled up a chair and sat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel said, without taking his eyes off the fire, "Sarah's dead." The words dropped into the room like stones thrown onto a frozen lake. Edward felt as if someone had punched him in the stomach. "Sarah," he repeated. "Your girlfriend? Wife? We got married 2 years ago. You didn't know because I didn't tell you. I didn't tell anyone in the family." The hurt in his voice was palpable. "And the baby is yours. Emma, our daughter. She's 5 weeks old. 5 weeks. A newborn baby in the middle of a deadly blizzard." "What happened to Sarah?" Edward asked calmly. Though his heart was racing, Daniel took a trembling breath. "We lived in Fairbanks. I worked at a warehouse loading trucks. Sarah worked at a cafe. We didn't have much money, but it was enough. We were happy. Even when Emma was born and things got tighter, we were happy." He paused, swallowed hard. The blizzard started. Everyone kept warning not to leave home, but the heater in our apartment broke. Completely. We called the landlord, but he didn't answer. The temperature inside kept dropping. Emma was too cold. We were scared to keep her there, so we decided to go to the city shelter. Just until the heat came back, you know. Daniel paused again, tears starting to fall. "We put Emma in the car, covered her with every blanket we had. Sarah drove because I don't have a license. We left, but the blizzard got worse too fast. Way too fast. Visibility went to 0. Sarah couldn't see a thing. Then another car appeared coming from the opposite direction, out of control, sliding on the ice." His voice broke completely. "Sarah swerved, lost control. We rolled off the shoulder, hit a tree. I hit my head but stayed conscious. Emma was crying, but seemed okay. But Sarah didn't respond. She hit her head on the steering wheel. There was blood, so much blood." Edward closed his eyes, nausea rising. "I tried calling 911, but there was no signal. I tried to revive her, but I didn't really know how. She was breathing but unconscious. I panicked. I grabbed Emma, got out of the car, tried to flag someone down on the road. But there was no one. No one. It was snowing so hard I could barely stand. I went back to the car, stayed with Sarah, held her hand, waited, kept trying to call. Finally got a signal, called 911. They said they'd send an ambulance, but everything was overwhelmed. It could take a while. I begged them to hurry. I pleaded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. Sarah stopped breathing 2 hours later. I tried CPR like I'd seen on TV, but it didn't work. She just stopped. She went cold. And I stayed there, alone with Emma, waiting for an ambulance that never came. The room fell into absolute silence, except for the crackling of the fireplace and the distant howl of the wind outside. The ambulance came 6 hours later. The paramedics said she died from head trauma, that there was nothing I could have done. They took her body. They offered to take me and Emma to the hospital, but I refused. I don't even know why. I think I was in shock. I stayed with the car, tried to start it, but it wouldn't. The engine was dead. I was trapped there. Tried to hitch a ride, but no one passed. My phone died. I had no money for absolutely anything. My wallet had $15. $15. Daniel looked directly at Edward for the first time. I thought about calling you, thought about it a lot, but I remembered the last things I said to you. The horrible things I yelled, and I was so proud. So stupidly proud. I'd rather freeze to death than call and ask for help. His words were both accusation and confession. Edward felt each one like a physical blow, because everything Daniel said was true. The fight had been ugly, brutal. Terrible words were said on both sides. And Edward, at the height of his anger and stubbornness, had let his grandson walk away without trying to stop him. 7 years of silence because of pride, because of money, because of hurt, and it had almost cost his grandson and great-granddaughter their lives. Daniel, Edward said slowly, choosing each word carefully, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about Sarah. I'm sorry for everything you went through, and I'm sorry for the things I said that day. Daniel turned his face away, looking again at the flames. You don't have to pretend. I know you never forgave me. It's not about forgiveness. It never was. It was about pain. About losing your grandmother and not knowing how to deal with it at all. You cut her out of the will. You cut my mother, your own daughter, out because of a stupid fight about her marriage. The old family wound reopened. Edward's daughter, Rebecca, Daniel's mother, had married a man her parents disapproved of, someone Edward considered irresponsible. Edward cut ties. Rebecca disinherited him. And when she died too young in a car accident, Edward didn't even attend the funeral. More pride, more stubbornness, more pain that turned into anger. I was wrong, Edward said simply. About everything. About your mother, about you. About letting pride destroy my family. Eleanor tried to make me see that before she died. She tried to make me fix things, but I didn't listen. And after she was gone, it was easier just to stay alone than to face my mistakes. Daniel finally looked at him again. His eyes were red, tired, but also full of something Edward couldn't quite identify. Anger, sadness, or maybe, just maybe, the faintest glimmer of hope. Why did you land? Daniel asked. You could have just flown straight home. You didn't even know who was in the car, because I saw someone who needed help, and because I've already lost too many people for not doing the right thing at the right time. Silence again. Then Daniel said, so quietly that Edward almost didn't hear him, thank you for saving me. And something inside Edward's chest, something that had been frozen for years, began slowly to melt. The first 3 days were marked by an uncomfortable silence that hung over the mansion, like the very snow that kept falling outside, relentless and endless. Are you enjoying the story? Then leave a comment below with what you think will happen between the grandfather and grandson. Do you believe in second chances? Share your opinion, and let's continue this journey together. Edward established a practical and efficient routine, treating the situation as he would any business problem that needed solving, with organization, resources, and minimal emotion. He turned the ground floor guest room into a suitable space for Daniel and Emma. He installed an extra portable heater. He brought down an old crib from the attic that had belonged to Rebecca decades earlier, cleaned it meticulously, and assembled it beside the bed. In the first hours after the rescue, Edward drove to the nearest town as soon as the blizzard gave a temporary break, took his sturdy pickup truck equipped with four-wheel drive and tire chains, and bought everything a newborn might need. Diapers of all sizes because he wasn't sure which would fit. Baby formula from 3 different brands because he didn't know which Emma would accept. Bottles, pacifiers, wipes, diaper cream, warm clothes, soft blankets. He spent almost $2,000 in a single trip. The young cashier looked at the 71-year-old man buying baby supplies with a curious expression but asked no questions. Edward offered no explanations. When he returned home with the loaded truck, he found Daniel exactly where he had left him. Sitting on the bed, looking out the window at the endless white landscape, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms. I brought what you'll need, Edward announced, walking in with several heavy bags. Daniel slowly turned his head, looked at the bags, then at Edward. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. The child needs things. I'll pay you back. As soon as I get a job, as soon as the storm passes, I'll pay you every cent. That stubborn pride again. Edward recognized it because it was the same pride he himself had worn like armor. Don't worry about that now. Just take care of Emma. Edward left the bags on the floor and walked out of the room before the conversation could drift into more uncomfortable territory. The mansion had 5 bedrooms in total. Edward occupied the master suite upstairs, a vast space overlooking the mountains, a view he rarely appreciated. The other 4 rooms remained closed and empty most of the time. Silent sanctuaries of an era when the house had once sheltered a real family instead of a lonely old man. Edward returned to his usual routine. He woke at 5:30 every morning, even at 71, made strong black coffee, read the news on his tablet, checked financial reports from his investments, even though he'd officially retired 5 years earlier. The money kept multiplying on its own. Managed by competent people, he paid very well to do exactly that. Before, that had been enough to fill his days. Money, reports, news, silence. But now, there was the sound of a baby crying echoing through the halls. Emma often cried during the night. Edward heard it from his room upstairs. He heard Daniel's tired footsteps pacing back and forth, the low murmur of a voice trying to soothe the child, the sound of a bottle being prepared in the kitchen. On the third night, at 3 in the morning, Edward went downstairs and found Daniel in the kitchen, visibly exhausted, trying to warm baby formula with trembling hands. Emma lay in an improvised carrier, crying with that sharp, desperate cry babies make when they're truly uncomfortable. "You're doing it wrong," Edward said from the doorway, making Daniel jump in fright. "I know I'm doing it wrong," Daniel replied, frustration clear in his voice. "I have no idea what I'm doing. Sarah used to do everything. She knew how to hold her right, how to make Emma burp, how much formula to give. I only helped sometimes, but I never really paid attention. And now she's gone, and I have no idea what to do." His voice broke on the last sentence. Edward entered the kitchen and took the bottle from Daniel's hands. "You're heating it too much. It should be warm, not hot. Test it on your wrist like this. See? If it burns you, it'll burn her mouth." He adjusted the temperature, tested it again, and handed the bottle back to Daniel. "Now hold her. Support her head properly. That's it. Tilt her a little. Don't lay her completely flat or she choke. Good, now, offer the bottle." Daniel followed the instructions mechanically. Emma latched onto the nipple and began to suck, her crying stopping instantly. A blessed silence fell over the kitchen. Daniel looked at Edward in surprise. "How do you know all this?" "I had a daughter. I had you as a grandson before you grew up, and I messed everything up." The casual mention of the past hung in the air between them like smoke. "I don't remember you doing any of this," Daniel said quietly. "Because when you were born, I'd already become the kind of man who thought raising a child was a woman's job. But when your mother was a baby, I helped. Eleanor worked too, so I had no choice. It was only a few years before I got rich enough for her to stop working, and when she stopped, I stopped helping. I thought I didn't have to anymore." Edward leaned against the counter, watching Daniel feed Emma, another one of my many mistakes. Too long a list to name them all. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just kept feeding his daughter, watching her little face relax as she drank. "Why do you care?" Daniel finally asked. "After everything, after years of not speaking to me, why do you care what happens to us now?" It was a fair question. Edward considered his words carefully. "Because I'm too old to keep pretending I didn't make mistakes. And because, honestly, these last few years alone in this house have shown me that money means nothing when you have no one to leave it to. Eleanor tried to tell me that. Your mother tried to tell me that. You tried to tell me that. But I was too stubborn to listen." He looked directly at Daniel. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't expect you to forget what I did or didn't do. But you're here now, and that child is here. And I can help, so I will. It's as simple as that." Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly. "Thank you. For everything. For the food, the clothes, the place to stay. I really didn't have anyone else. And Sarah's parents? Dead. She grew up in foster homes. That's how we met, actually. I was volunteering at a shelter. She'd just aged out of the system. We talked. She was funny, smart. She loved books. Dreamed of opening a bookstore someday." His voice grew distant. "We connected because we both understood what it was like not to have a real family, so we decided to make our own. Just the two of us. And then Emma." Edward felt a pang in his chest. Daniel had built his own family because the original one had failed him so completely. "She sounds like a good person. She was the best person I ever knew." Silence again. Emma finished her bottle and began to close her little eyes, content and sleepy. "Let me show you how to make her burp," Edward said. "Tomorrow, you'll have to do it alone again. But at least tonight I'll help." And for the first time in 7 years, grandfather and grandson worked together on something, even if it was just making a baby burp at 3 in the morning in a quiet kitchen while the blizzard raged outside. The following days settled into a hesitant pattern of coexistence. Edward kept his morning routine but started making enough coffee for 2. He left an extra cup on the kitchen table before Daniel came down. He never said anything about it, just left it there. Daniel began leaving the room more often, exploring the mansion with Emma in his arms. He spent time in the enormous library on the first floor, looking at the hundreds of books Edward had collected over the years but rarely read. He sat in the armchair by the window, watching the snow fall, rocking his daughter. Edward watched from a distance, not getting too close, gave him space, respected the process, but slowly, very slowly, the distance began to shrink. On the 5th day, Edward was making lunch in the kitchen, just a simple sandwich, when Daniel appeared in the doorway with Emma. "Can I make one too?" Daniel asked hesitantly. "Sure, there's cold cuts in the fridge, bread in that drawer over there." Daniel made his sandwich in silence. The two ate at the small corner table in the kitchen, not in the formal dining room Edward never used. Emma slept in the stroller between them. "The blizzard will pass soon," Edward said. "Forecast says 2 more days and then it'll start to clear." "Yeah, do you have plans? What you'll do after?" Daniel paused, sandwich midair. "I don't know. Go back to Fairbanks, I guess. Try to recover my things from the apartment if the landlord hasn't thrown everything out. Look for a job. Find a place to live with Emma. With what money?" The question came out harsher than Edward intended. Daniel put the sandwich back on the plate. "I'll figure it out. I always do. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying you don't have to do it all alone. You have a newborn. You need help. I didn't come here asking for money. I know you didn't. You didn't even want to come. But you're here now." Daniel pushed the plate away, losing his appetite. "What are you suggesting?" Edward took a deep breath. He'd been thinking about it for days, but wasn't sure if it was a good idea. Wasn't sure if Daniel would accept it. Wasn't sure of anything. "Really? Stay here. For now. Until you get back on your feet. Until you figure things out. There's plenty of space. Everything you and Emma need. And I can help with the baby while you look for work or do what you need to do." Daniel looked at him as if he'd spoken another language. "You're offering for me to live here. Temporarily. Until you get organized. Why? Because it's the right thing to do." "No, the real reason." Edward met Daniel's eyes and decided to be brutally honest. "Because I'm 71. Because I've spent the last 5 years completely alone in this huge house. Because I failed your mother and failed you. And I don't want to fail Emma too. And because, selfishly, having you here makes me feel less alone." The raw honesty of the words made them both uncomfortable. Daniel looked away. "I don't know if I can stay here. There's too much bad history, too much pain, I know. And I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to my mother, for not going to her funeral, for staying away when she needed you most." Edward nodded slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm only offering practical help. You can take it or leave it. It's your choice." Daniel looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the tension around her. "I need to think. Take all the time you need." Edward stood, took his plate to the sink, and left Daniel alone with his thoughts. That night, the blizzard intensified again with renewed fury. The wind howled around the mansion like a wild animal. Snow pounded the windows hard. The temperature dropped even lower. Edward was in the library, reading financial reports without really processing the words, when he heard a strange sound coming from Daniel's room. Crying, not a baby's, an adult's. Edward set the tablet aside and quietly walked down the hallway. Daniel's door was slightly ajar. Through the crack he could see Daniel sitting on the bed. Emma asleep in the crib beside him, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs he tried to stifle with his hand. Edward stood there, unsure what to do. Go in, pretend he hadn't seen, walk away. But then he remembered something Eleanor used to say. Sometimes people don't need words, they just need to know they're not alone. He knocked softly on the door. Daniel quickly wiped his face, turning around. "Sorry, I tried to keep quiet." "You don't need to apologize for feeling," Edward said, stepping into the room. He sat on the chair beside the bed, the same chair he'd sat in on the first night. "Do you want to talk?" Daniel shook his head no, then changed his mind and nodded yes. "I just miss her so much, and I get angry because she shouldn't have died. We were just trying to keep Emma safe from the cold. We were just trying to do the right thing. And now she's gone, and I'm alone, and I don't know how to raise a daughter by myself." The words poured out in a rush. "I'm 22. I can barely take care of myself. How am I supposed to take care of a baby? How am I supposed to give Emma everything she needs? How am I supposed to be both father and mother?" Edward let Daniel talk, just listening. "And the worst part is that I'm angry at you too. I'm angry because you have everything. You have money, this huge house, resources, and you offer help now. But where were you when my mom died? Where were you when I was 15 and needed a grandfather?" The accusation was fair, and Edward didn't try to defend himself. "I wasn't there, and you have every right to be angry at me. But I also can't stay angry because you saved me. You saved Emma, and you're trying to help now, even though you don't have to. And that confuses me because I wanted it to be simple. I wanted you to just be the villain of the story. But you're not only that." Daniel buried his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do." Edward stayed silent for a moment, choosing his words. "When your grandmother was dying, in the hospital in her last days, she made me promise something. She made me promise I'd fix things with Rebecca, that I'd look for you, that I'd swallow my pride and be the bigger man." He paused. "I promised, and then she died. And I broke that promise. Because it was easier to stay angry and alone than to admit I was wrong. It was easier to blame everyone else than to look in the mirror." Edward looked straight at Daniel. "I can't go back in time. I can't bring your mother back. I can't bring Sarah back. I can't undo 7 years of silence. But I can be here now. I can help now. And I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't erase anything, but it's what I have to give." Daniel wiped his face again, taking a deep breath to calm himself. "If I stay here, for a while, I need clear rules. I don't want charity. I want to work, earn my own money, pay my share. And I need space. I need to be able to leave when I decide it's time. I agree to all of that, and you can't try to buy my forgiveness." You can't think that just because you're helping now, everything is forgiven. I don't think that. Daniel nodded slowly. Then I'll stay. For now. Until I figure out what to do next. Edward felt something release in his chest. Not full relief. Not happiness. But something. A small, fragile beginning of something that might, perhaps, one day become a second chance. Thank you, Edward said simply. Don't thank me yet. We still have a lot to figure out. I know. Emma stirred in her crib, making a soft little sound. Both men looked at her automatically, that small, innocent being who wasn't to blame for any of it, who deserved better than a broken, wounded family. She looks like Sarah, Daniel said quietly. The eyes, the way she frowns when she's asleep, she'll grow up knowing her mother was an incredible person. We'll make sure of that. Daniel looked at Edward in surprise at the word we, and for the first time since the rescue, he gave a small, tired smile. Yeah, we'll make sure of that. Outside, the blizzard continued. But inside the mansion, something had subtly changed. The ice between grandfather and grandson hadn't completely melted, far from it, but small cracks had begun to appear, and sometimes, cracks are enough to let the light in. The second week brought subtle but significant changes to the household dynamic. The blizzard finally relented, leaving Alaska blanketed by meters of compacted snow that glistened under the pale winter sun. The main roads were slowly reopened. Life had begun to return to normal, at least on the outside. Inside the mansion, however, an entirely new life was forming. Edward woke up one Saturday morning to the smell of fresh coffee rising from downstairs. That was unusual. He was always the first to wake, the first to make coffee. He went down the stairs curiously and found Daniel in the kitchen, still in pajamas, making pancakes while Emma watched from her stroller, awake and alert. Good morning, Daniel said without turning round, focused on flipping a pancake that threatened to stick to the pan. Good morning. You're cooking, trying to cook? There's a difference. Edward poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, watching Daniel manage to rescue the pancake at the last second, placing it on a plate with 3 others already made. They weren't perfect. One was burned on one edge, another looked half raw in the middle, but they were made. I thought I'd make breakfast, Daniel explained, bringing the plate to the table along with butter and maple syrup. You've been doing everything since we got here. I thought it was fair to contribute. It was a small but meaningful gesture. Edward accepted a pancake. Thank you. They ate in comfortable silence, something that would have been impossible a week earlier. Emma made soft noises, those vague sounds babies make when they're content in observing the world. I was thinking, Daniel said, between bites. You said I could work to pay my share. Is there anything you need done around here? House maintenance? Hangar work? Anything? Edward considered the offer. The truth was, he paid people to do practically everything. But Daniel needed to feel that he was contributing, that he wasn't just a charity case. The hangar needs organizing. There are boxers of airplane parts piled up for years, and the library could use proper cataloging. I have hundreds of books but no real system. Daniel nodded, looking relieved to have something concrete to do. I can do that. And I can take care of Emma at the same time. There's no rush. Do it at your own pace. I want to do it. I need to do something besides just sitting around thinking too much. Edward understood perfectly. Work was therapy. It always had been for him too. After breakfast, Daniel took Emma to the hangar while Edward stayed in the house reviewing some documents. But his mind kept returning to the morning scene, to the imperfect pancakes, to Daniel's gesture of trying to contribute, small steps, but steps in the right direction. Later that day, Edward went to the hangar to check on Daniel. He found him sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by open boxes. Emma asleep on a makeshift blanket beside him, while he sorted screws, nuts, tools, and manuals into organized piles. This place is a maze, Daniel said without looking up. You keep everything. You never know when you might need a specific part. Half these boxers have stuff from planes you don't even own anymore. Edward shrugged. A lifelong habit. I grew up with nothing. When I finally had things, I never wanted to throw anything away. Daniel stopped what he was doing and looked up. I didn't know that. That you grew up with nothing. It's not something I talked about much. My father was a fisherman in a small inland village. We lived in a two-room house. 6 people. In the winter we froze because we couldn't afford enough heating. Food was whatever my father could catch or hunt. Edward leaned against the workbench. I left home at 16, came to Anchorage with $23 in my pocket. Worked on oil rigs hard, dangerous jobs no one wanted. I saved every cent, learned everything I could, eventually started my own business, and got rich. I did, but I paid a price for it. I worked 18 hours a day. Missed the first years of your mother's life because I was always traveling, always in meetings, always closing one more deal. Eleanor raised Rebecca practically alone. He looked at Emma sleeping peacefully. When I finally stopped to pay attention, Rebecca was already a teenager and saw me as a stranger. I tried to make up for it with money, with gifts, with everything but my time, and she resented it. Rightfully so. Daniel resumed sorting boxes, processing the information. My mother never talked much about you. When I asked, she just said you were too different to get along. She was being kind. The truth is, I was a terrible father. And when she chose to marry your father against my wishes, I used that as an excuse to cut ties. I told her she was making a mistake, that he wasn't good enough, that she was throwing her life away. My father wasn't perfect, Daniel said slowly. He drank too much, had trouble keeping jobs. But he loved my mother, and he loved me, in his own way. I know that now. But back then, I only saw what I wanted to see. I saw someone with no money, no ambition in the way I defined ambition, and I decided he wasn't enough for my daughter. Edward took a deep breath. Your father died when you were what, 9-8? Heart attack. He was only 36, and I didn't go to the funeral, didn't offer financial help, didn't do anything. Because I was still angry at the choice Rebecca had made years earlier. My mother worked 3 jobs to raise me alone after that, Daniel said, his voice tight. I barely saw her. She left early in the morning and came back late at night. We lived in a tiny apartment. I wore thrift store clothes, ate at school because it was the only decent meal I had. He stopped, looking at Edward. And I knew you existed, knew you had money. My mother never badmouthed you, but I understood. I understood you could have helped and chose not to. The words cut like knives, but Edward accepted them. He deserved every one. You're right, I could have helped. I should have helped, and I didn't because I was proud and stubborn and thought I was right. Why are you telling me all this now? Daniel asked. Because you deserve the truth, not softened versions or excuses. The ugly, real truth. I failed as a father. I failed as a grandfather. And if I want any chance of doing better now, I at least have to be honest about my mistakes. Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring at his grease-stained hands. When my mother died, I was 15. Her car was hit by a drunk driver. She died instantly. And suddenly I was alone. Completely alone. His voice dropped. Social services wanted to put me in an orphanage. I remember the caseworker saying they'd try to contact relatives. I gave them your name, your number, and I waited. Edward felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. You never called back, Daniel continued. The caseworker said you were notified about my mother's death and my situation, and you didn't respond. Daniel, I stayed in an orphanage for 3 years. 3 years. Until I turned 18 and could leave. And during those 3 years, I hated you. I hated you with every fiber of my being. Because you could have taken me out of there. Could have given me a home, a family, and you chose to do nothing. Edward had no defense, no justification. Only the ugly truth. I did receive the notice. I read about Rebecca's death. I read about you being in state custody. And I did nothing because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of finally facing what I had done. Afraid of looking at you and seeing the accusation in your eyes. Afraid of having to be a real grandfather when I had failed so completely as a father. So I pretended I hadn't received the notice. Pretended I didn't know. And left you in that orphanage. Tears began streaming down Edward's face. Something he hadn't allowed in years. It was the most cowardly thing I ever did. And I have to live with it forever. Daniel's eyes were wet too. Why are you telling me this? Why not just lie? It would be easier, because lies are what got us here. Lies and pride and cowardice. And if there's any chance, any tiny chance to rebuild something between us, it has to start with truth. A heavy silence filled the hangar. Emma stirred under the blanket but didn't wake. Finally, Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand. I don't know if I can forgive that. I don't know if I ever will. I don't expect you to, but I understand why you're trying now. I understand that you're old and alone and regretful, and that has to count for something, right? There was a desperate question in those words. A fragile hope that genuine remorse might mean something. I hope it does, Edward said honestly, but I don't know. Daniel went back to sorting boxes, needing to do something with his hands. Let's do this then, one day at a time. No big promises, no unrealistic expectations. Just one day at a time, trying to do better than yesterday. Edward nodded. One day at a time, it was all they could offer each other, all they could ask for. One day at a time, building something new on the ruins of what had been destroyed. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, Edward went up to the attic for the first time in years. There were boxes there, 2 boxes he had never had the courage to open. Boxes with Eleanor's things, Rebecca's things. He found what he was looking for in a box labeled Rebecca, childhood, old photo albums. He sat on the dusty floor and began to flip through them. Rebecca as a baby in Eleanor's arms. Rebecca as a child, smiling without her front teeth. Rebecca as a teenager, already with that defiant look Edward knew so well. And then photos of Rebecca as an adult, with a man Edward recognized as Daniel's father. They looked happy, genuinely happy. And there were photos of Daniel, baby Daniel, little Daniel. Photos Edward had never seen because he'd never cared to ask. He spent hours there, looking at pictures of a life he'd lost by his own choice. A family he'd destroyed out of pride. When he finally came back downstairs, it was past midnight. He carried one of the photo albums with him. The next morning, he left the album on the kitchen table before Daniel came down. When Daniel found it and began flipping through, recognizing his young mother, recognizing himself as a child, he looked at Edward with an expression that was part surprise, part gratitude, part pain. "Thank you," Daniel said simply, and Edward just nodded, not trusting his voice to respond. Small steps. Small bridges being built over a vast chasm, but they were steps. And sometimes, steps are enough. The following weeks brought a routine neither man expected but both secretly appreciated. Edward woke early as always, but now made enough coffee for two and left a cup ready on the table. Daniel came down with Emma about half an hour later, and they had breakfast together in comfortable silence, punctuated only by Emma's soft sounds from her stroller. The Tuesday morning of the third week started differently. Edward was reading the digital paper when Daniel entered the kitchen carrying Emma awkwardly, his face worried and tense. "Something's wrong with her," Daniel said bluntly, his voice full of barely contained panic. "She's really hot, and she won't feed. Something's wrong." Edward immediately stood and approached. He gently touched Emma's forehead and felt the intense heat radiating from the baby's delicate skin. "She has a fever." "A high one," Edward confirmed, his own heart racing. "How long has she been like this?" "I don't know. She was fine when she slept last night, but when I woke up an hour ago, she was hot and crying differently, like a weak cry. I tried to give her the bottle, but she wouldn't take it." Edward forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help anyone. "We're going to the hospital now. Grab her coat and some blankets. I'll get the truck keys." 15 minutes later they were on the road, Edward driving carefully but fast along the highway, still partially covered in packed snow. The nearest hospital was in Anchorage, almost 2 hours away. Too far. Much too far. Daniel sat in the back seat with Emma, holding his daughter against his chest, whispering soothing words that were more for himself than for the baby. "She's going to be okay." Edward said both a statement and a hope. Babies get sick, they get fevers. It's normal. What if it's not just a fever? What if it's something serious? "Sarah died, Grandpa. She just died, and there was nothing I could do. I can't lose Emma too. I can't." Daniel's voice broke completely on the last words. Edward gripped the steering wheel tighter, pressing the accelerator a little more despite the dangerous road conditions. "You're not going to lose her, I promise. We'll get to the hospital, and the doctors will take care of her." He couldn't guarantee that promise. He had no control over what would happen, but he had to say something. Had to offer something other than fear. The drive felt endless. Every minute was silent torture. Emma whimpered weakly in the back seat, a sound that tore at Edward's heart in ways he didn't know were possible. When they finally reached Providence Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, Edward parked erratically at the emergency entrance, not caring about regulations. He helped Daniel out with Emma, and the three of them rushed inside. The nurse at reception looked up, saw the urgency on their faces and the baby in Daniel's arms, and immediately called a medical team. Everything happened very fast after that. A young Dr. Chen, according to her badge, quickly examined Emma while asking Daniel direct questions about symptoms, duration, and medical history. Daniel tried to answer, but the words came out jumbled, confused. Edward placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder, helping him focus. "Breathe. One symptom at a time." Daniel took a deep breath and managed to provide the necessary information. Emma was taken into an exam room. They inserted a digital thermometer that confirmed a fever of 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Much too high for such a small baby. Dangerously high. "We're going to run some tests," Dr. Chen explained calmly but efficiently. "Blood, urine, possibly a spinal tap depending on the initial results. We need to rule out serious infections." "Spinal tap," Daniel repeated, panic returning. "Isn't that dangerous?" "It's a standard procedure for infants with high fever and no obvious cause. It helps identify meningitis or other central nervous system infections. I know it sounds scary, but it's necessary." Daniel looked at Edward with desperate eyes, seeking guidance, seeking someone to tell him what to do. "Do what the doctor recommends," Edward said firmly. "She knows what she's doing." Daniel nodded mechanically and signed the consent forms a nurse brought over. Then Emma was taken to another room. Daniel tried to follow, but the nurse gently explained that parents had to wait outside during the procedures. Parents? She had used the word in the plural automatically, including Edward. He didn't correct her. They waited in the small windowless waiting room. Daniel couldn't sit still. He paced back and forth, hands trembling, face pale. "I shouldn't have brought her to Alaska," Daniel blurted suddenly. "We were living in Fairbanks, but I should have gone somewhere warmer, somewhere with better hospitals nearby. I made bad decisions, and now Emma's paying for it." "You didn't make bad decisions. You were trying to survive. You were doing the best you could with what you had. My best wasn't enough. It's never enough." Edward stood and faced him, forcing eye contact. "Listen, you're a good father. You took your daughter and kept her alive and warm in the middle of a deadly blizzard. You protected her when the whole world was falling apart. You're here now, doing everything right, getting her medical help. That's what a good father does." "I'm so scared," Daniel admitted, his voice cracking. "So scared of losing her like I lost Sarah." "I know, but you're not alone now. I'm here, and we'll get through this together, no matter what happens." Something changed in Daniel's face when he heard those words. A small part of the tension eased. Not much, but enough for him to breathe a little deeper. They waited 45 minutes that felt like 45 hours. Finally, Dr. Chen returned, her face professional but carrying a slight, reassuring smile. Good news. The preliminary tests show no signs of meningitis or severe bacterial infections. It appears to be a common viral infection, probably a cold that developed into a fever. We'll keep her under observation for 24 hours. Administer 4 fluids and medication to reduce the fever. But I expect a full recovery. Daniel literally collapsed into the nearest chair, the relief so overwhelming his legs could no longer support him. She's going to be okay, he asked, needing to hear it again. Yes, she's going to be fine. Babies get sick. It's scary, but usually not serious. You did the right thing bringing her in right away. Edward felt his own knees weaken with relief. Can we see her? Of course. Follow me. Emma was in a small hospital crib, connected to a tiny 4 in her equally tiny arm. She already looked better, more alert, curiously observing the environment. The fever was beginning to drop with the medication. Daniel approached the crib and gently touched his daughter's hand. Emma instinctively grasped his finger, and Daniel began to cry silently, tears of pure relief running down his face. Edward stood a little behind, giving space for the moment between father and daughter, but his own throat tightened with emotion. They stayed at the hospital all day and night. Edward left briefly to fetch clean clothes and supplies, but returned quickly. He brought decent food from a restaurant because hospital food was inedible. He brought a comfortable pillow for Daniel because hospital chairs were terrible. During the night, while Daniel finally slept in a reclined chair beside Emma's crib, Edward stayed awake, watching his grandson sleep with a protective hand resting on his daughter's crib even in unconsciousness. Watching Emma breathe softly, healthy and recovering, and he thought about family, about what family truly means. It wasn't shared blood, though that existed. It wasn't legal obligation, though that existed too. It was this. Being present at 3 in the morning in a hospital, driving 2 hours through dangerous conditions because someone you love needs help, holding space so another person can fall apart, knowing someone will catch them. Eleanor had tried to teach him that decades ago. She had tried to make him understand that money and success meant nothing without people to share them with. He hadn't listened then, but he was listening now. Too late for Eleanor. Too late for Rebecca. But maybe, just maybe, not too late for Daniel and Emma. The next morning, Emma was discharged from the hospital. Dr. Chen gave detailed instructions about home care, warning signs to watch for, and medications to administer. Daniel listened attentively, asking questions, taking notes on his phone. On the way back home, Daniel was noticeably calmer, though still obviously exhausted from the sleepless night. "Thank you," he said suddenly, as Edward drove. "For everything? For driving all the way here? For staying at the hospital? For not letting me completely panic? You don't need to thank me. That's what family does." The word hung in the air between them. Family. Edward had said it naturally, without thinking, but once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "It's funny," he said finally. "I spent so much time angry at you, so much time thinking I'd never want anything to do with you. And now, when I needed someone, you were there, and you still are. I want to be," Edward said honestly. "I want to be here for you and for Emma. If you'll let me, I'm letting you. It's still strange. There's still hurt that doesn't just disappear. But I'm letting you." They drove in silence for a few more miles. "You know what Sarah used to say?" Daniel continued, looking out the window at the passing white landscape. "She used to say, family isn't just who gives birth to you, it's who shows up, who chooses to stay even when things get hard." He looked at Edward. "You're showing up now. That has to count for something." Edward felt emotion tighten his throat again. "I want to keep showing up, every day, for as long as you'll let me, then keep doing it, and we'll see what happens." It wasn't full forgiveness. It wasn't magical reconciliation, but it was a door left ajar. It was a possibility. And for Edward, at that moment, it was more than he thought he deserved. When they got home, Edward helped Daniel carry Emma inside. The baby was fully recovered now, back to her usual quiet curiosity about the world. "Go rest," Edward instructed. "You're dead tired. I'll take care of Emma for a few hours." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Go sleep." Daniel hesitated only a second before agreeing. He was too exhausted to argue. He handed Emma to Edward and went upstairs, collapsing on the bed fully dressed. Edward was alone with Emma for the first time. He carried her into the living room, sat down in the comfortable armchair near the fireplace, and simply held her. Emma looked up at him with those big dark eyes that reminded him so much of Daniel, so much of Rebecca, eyes that contained all the promise and potential of a life just beginning. "Hi, little one," Edward whispered. "Your dad's sleeping, so it's just you and me for now. You'll have to put up with me." Emma made a soft sound that could have meant anything or nothing. "I wasn't a good grandfather to your dad," Edward continued, feeling vaguely ridiculous talking to a baby, but needing to say the words anyway. "Actually, I wasn't a grandfather at all. I completely failed him. But I won't fail you, I promise. I'll be here. I'll protect you. I'll love you the way I should have loved him." Emma yawned, her little eyes beginning to close. "And maybe, if I do right by you, your dad will let me try to do better by him too. Maybe it's not too late to fix some things." He rocked Emma gently, humming softly a melody that Eleanor used to sing to Rebecca when she was a baby. A melody Edward had forgotten he even knew until that moment. Emma fell asleep in his arms, and Edward sat there holding his great-granddaughter, feeling her small precious weight against his chest, and for the first time in a very long while, felt something close to peace. Hours later, when Daniel came back downstairs, he found Edward still in the armchair, still holding Emma, both of them sleeping peacefully. Daniel stopped in the doorway, watching the scene. His grandfather, the man he had hated for so long, the man who had abandoned him when he needed him most, was now holding his daughter with the lofty gentleness and care of someone cradling something infinitely precious. And Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet, but it was a softening, a recognition that people are complicated, that they can fail terribly and still try to do better, that it's never entirely too late to start again. He took a photo with his phone, not to post anywhere, just to remember this moment. This fragile, improbable beginning of something that might, eventually, become a real family. Edward woke at the soft click of the phone. He saw Daniel standing there, and for a moment felt embarrassed, as if caught doing something inappropriate. "Sorry," he began. "She fell asleep, and I didn't want to put her in the crib and risk waking her." "It's okay," Daniel said. Walking into the room, "You both looked comfortable." He carefully took Emma from Edward's arms and carried her to the crib in her room. When he returned, he sat on the couch facing the armchair where Edward still sat. "I've been thinking," Daniel began, "about what you said at the hospital, about family, and about showing up. Yes, I think I want to try, really try, not just stay here temporarily until I figure things out, but actually try to build something, to get to know you again, or maybe for the first time, since I never really knew you properly." Edward felt hope bloom in his chest, cautious but real. "I'd like that very much, but it has to be honest. Both ways. No hiding the hard stuff. No pretending everything's fine when it's not." "I completely agree." Daniel took a deep breath. "So here's a hard truth. I'm still angry at you for abandoning me, for not going to my mother's funeral, for all the choices you made that hurt me. And that anger doesn't just vanish because you're being nice now, I know, and you have every right to be angry. But at the same time," Daniel continued, "I'm grateful for what you're doing now, for saving me in the blizzard, for taking Emma to the hospital, for trying. And those two things can exist at the same time. Anger and gratitude, pain and hope. They can," Edward agreed. "And it's okay that they do. Real relationships are complicated. It's not all or nothing." Exactly. They were silent for a moment, but it was a different kind of silence now, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. "My turn for a hard truth," Edward said. "I'm afraid of messing this up, of doing something wrong and pushing you away again, of not being the grandfather you and Emma deserved, because I don't have much practice at being a good person in relationships. I have far more practice at being successful in business. Then we'll mess up together," Daniel said with a small smile. "I certainly don't know what I'm doing as a dad. I make it up as I go. We can make it up together." Edward smiled, to a genuine smile that transformed his aged face. "Make it up together. I like that." That night, after the dinner, they cooked together, trying a complicated recipe that didn't turn out quite right but was edible. Daniel suggested watching a movie, something they'd never done together. They chose a light comedy, something that didn't require much thought. They sat on the big living room couch, Emma asleep in her stroller beside them, and watched. It was simple, ordinary, exactly the kind of thing normal families did without a second thought. But for Edward and Daniel, it wasn't ordinary. It was extraordinary. A small, fragile miracle, this shared moment of normalcy. And when the movie ended and Daniel got up to take Emma to bed, he paused and looked at Edward. "Good night, Grandpa." Two simple words, but heavy with meaning, heavy with acceptance, heavy with a possible future. "Good night, Daniel." And as Edward sat alone in the living room after Daniel went upstairs, watching the dying embers in the fireplace, he thought about second chances, about how they rarely came wrapped neatly, how they usually arrived through pain and loss in desperate situations. But they did come. Sometimes for the lucky enough to recognize them, and the brave enough to seize them. Edward had received his second chance in the middle of a blizzard, finding his grandson freezing to death on the side of a road, and he wasn't going to waste it. Not this time. Spring came to Alaska hesitantly and unevenly, as it always did. The snow began to melt slowly, revealing the brown, wet earth beneath. The days grew longer. The light returned gradually, turning the long winter nights into something more bearable, more alive. 3 months had passed since the blizzard rescue. 3 months of small progress and occasional setbacks. 3 months of building something neither man had the exact words to describe, but both could feel growing between them like a stubborn plant pushing its way through the ice. Edward was in the kitchen one April morning making coffee when Daniel walked in carrying Emma, who was now noticeably bigger, more alert, beginning to smile genuinely at familiar faces. "She slept through the night," Daniel announced with obvious pride. "All night, 7 straight hours. That's an important milestone," Edward said, smiling genuinely. "Congratulations to you both." Daniel set Emma in the high chair they'd bought a few weeks earlier and began preparing her morning bottle. His movements were confident now, efficient. Gone was the hesitant panic of those early days. "I got an email last night," Daniel said casually, testing the formula's temperature on his wrist. from the Anchorage Public Library. They have an opening for an assistant. Doesn't pay much, but it's a start. I was thinking of applying. Edward paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. You're moving to Anchorage. There was something in his voice. Not exactly fear, but something close to it. The prospect of returning to solitude now that he'd grown used to voices in the house, to life echoing in once empty walls. Daniel picked up Emma and began feeding her, avoiding direct eye contact with Edward. I don't know. I'm weighing my options. I mean, I can't stay here forever, right? Eventually, I need to build my own life, have my own place, be independent. Of course, Edward said, quickly perhaps, too quickly. Of course you do. You're 22. You need to live your life. An uncomfortable silence settled over the kitchen. Emma made soft noises as she drank, oblivious to the tension. But, Daniel continued slowly, still looking at his daughter, I was also thinking that Emma likes it here, that she's doing well here, that you're good with her. And maybe, if you'd like, we could stay a little longer. Not forever necessarily, but for a while. Edward felt something loosen in his chest. I'd love that. You can stay as long as you like. There's no rush at all. Daniel finally looked at him. But if I stay, it has to be as adults sharing a space. Not as you do in charity. I want to pay rent. I want to contribute to expenses. I want it to be a real arrangement, not you taking care of me like a child. I understand. We can set something fair, and I'm still going to apply for the job, because I need to work. I need to do something with my life besides staying here in the mansion. That makes perfect sense. Anchorage isn't that far. You could commute, or stay there a few days when needed. We can make it work. Daniel nodded, seeming relieved that Edward wasn't trying to trap or control him. Thank you for understanding. I just want you to be happy, and to build a good life for yourself and Emma. If that includes staying here, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. It was true, Edward realized as he said it. He genuinely wanted what was best for Daniel, even if it meant watching him leave. That was the kind of love Eleanor had tried to teach him decades ago. Love that lets go when needed. Love that doesn't cling. The following weeks brought practical changes. Daniel applied for the job and was called for an interview. Edward offered to drive him to Anchorage. The interview went well. Daniel was offered the position starting the next month. They discussed logistics. Daniel would commute 3 times a week at first. On other days, he'd work remotely when possible, helping with digital cataloging. Edward insisted on buying Daniel a reliable car, calling it an investment in Emma's safety when Daniel tried to refuse. It's not charity, Edward said firmly. It's a grandfather making sure his great-granddaughter isn't on dangerous roads in a car that could break down. Accept the gift, Daniel. Daniel finally accepted. They were learning. Learning when to yield, when to insist, when to set pride aside. One May afternoon, Edward took Daniel and Emma to a small cemetery outside Fairbanks. It was the first time they had returned to the city since the rescue. I haven't been here since the funeral, Daniel admitted as they walked among the headstones. I couldn't. They stopped in front of a simple new grave. Sarah Mitchell, beloved wife and mother, followed by dates cruelly close together. Daniel knelt, placing Emma carefully on the soft grass beside him. Emma immediately began exploring the grass with her tiny fingers, fascinated by the texture. Hi, love, Daniel said softly to the gravestone. I brought someone to meet you. Well, 2 people actually. Edward stood a few steps back, giving him space. This is Emma, our daughter. She's huge now, growing so fast. You'd be so proud of her. She's strong, like you were. And this is my grandfather, Edward. I know you never met him. I talked about him sometimes. Not always good things. But he's changed. Or I have, or we both have. Tears began running down Daniel's face. I miss you so much. Every day. Emma needs you. I need you. It's not fair that you're not here to see her grow. To see her first smile, her first word, her first steps. You should be here. His voice broke completely. But Edward's been helping. He's been there in ways I never expected. And I think you'd like him if you'd had the chance to meet him. I think you'd say family is who shows up. And he's been showing up. Edward felt tears in his own eyes. He turned slightly, giving Daniel privacy for his grief. After several minutes, Daniel stood, picked up Emma, and walked over to where Edward was waiting. Thank you for bringing me here. Anytime you want to come back, just say so. They stood there for a few more moments in respectful silence, then walked back to the car. On the drive home, Daniel said something unexpected. I'd like to visit my mother's grave too. I've never been. After the funeral, I just couldn't. But I think it's time. Edward swallowed hard. I've never been either. After the funeral, I didn't attend. I know where it is. Your grandmother's buried in the same cemetery. We can go together, if you'd like. Yes, I'd like that. The following Saturday, Edward drove to Anchorage again. The cemetery was larger than the one in Fairbanks, older, with mature trees shading the paths between graves. They found Eleanor's gravestone first. Edward had paid for something elaborate, expensive granite with gold-engraved letters. Eleanor Callahan, beloved wife, devoted mother, loving grandmother. Hi, Grandma, Daniel said softly, touching the cold stone. Sorry I didn't come sooner. Sorry for a lot of things. Edward placed the flowers he'd brought at the base of the gravestone. "Hi, darling. I brought our grandson to visit, and our great-granddaughter. You'd be so happy to meet her." So proud of Daniel. He paused, struggling for words. "I finally did what you asked. I found him. I fixed things. Or at least I'm trying. I'm sorry it took so long. Sorry I didn't listen when I still had time." They stood there for several minutes before walking to the nearby grave. Rebecca Callahan Morrison, beloved daughter, devoted mother, free spirit. Daniel began crying as soon as he read the words. Edward placed a hand on his shoulder, his own vision blurred with tears. "Hi, Mom," Daniel whispered. "I became a dad. I have a daughter, Emma. She has your eyes. She's stubborn too, I think." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Grandpa's here with me. I know you two fought. I know it was complicated, but he's trying to do better now. He's trying to be the grandfather he should have been to me. The great-grandfather Emma deserves, and I'm letting him try. I hope you're not mad about that. I hope you understand." Edward knelt beside the grave, placing his hands on the cold earth. "Rebecca, my daughter, I failed you in every possible way. I wasn't there when you were a child. I rejected your choices when you were an adult. I didn't attend your funeral when you passed. I didn't take care of your son when he needed me." His voice broke. "I can't go back. I can't fix what I broke. But I'm trying to do better with Daniel. I'm trying to be the father I should have been to you by being a better grandfather to him. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have to offer now." Daniel knelt beside him. The two men, separated by decades and united by blood and grief, cried together for the woman they had both loved and lost. Emma, sitting in Daniel's lap, looked around with innocent curiosity, not understanding the gravity of the moment but sensing the emotion around her. After a long while, they stood. They walked back to the car in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not uncomfortable, just two people processing shared grief. In the car, before starting the engine, Edward turned to Daniel. "I have something for you. I've been waiting for the right moment." He took a large envelope from the glove compartment and handed it to Daniel. "What's this?" "Open it." Daniel opened it. Inside were legal documents, documents altering Edward's will, documents establishing a trust fund for Emma, documents naming Daniel as the primary heir to the entire estate. "I don't want your money," Daniel said immediately, trying to hand the envelope back. "I know you don't, and that's exactly why you should have it. It's not about money. It's about ensuring Emma has every opportunity, that you have security, that you're never in a desperate position again. But I didn't do anything to deserve this. You gave me a second chance. You let me try to be better. That's worth more than all the money I've ever made." Daniel looked at the documents, then at Edward. "I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything. Just take it, please." Daniel carefully folded the papers and placed them back into the envelope. "Thank you, not just for the money, for everything, for showing up in that blizzard, for staying, for trying. Thank you for letting me try." They drove home as the sun began to set, painting the Alaskan sky in impossible shades of pink and orange. That night, after Emma was asleep and the house was quiet, Edward and Daniel sat on the back porch of the mansion, looking out at the distant mountains. The snow had almost completely melted now. Green was beginning to show, life returning after the brutal winter. "You know," Daniel said thoughtfully, "when I was trapped in that car, freezing, with Emma in my arms, I really thought I was going to die. I thought we both were, and I kept thinking about all the things I would do differently if I had another chance. Like what? I wouldn't be so proud. I wouldn't let old grudges stop me from asking for help when I needed it. I wouldn't waste time being angry when I could be spending it building something new." He looked at Edward. "And then you showed up, literally from the sky, and you gave me that other chance. Gave us that other chance. And I'm trying not to waste it. I'm trying not to waste my second chance either," Edward said. "I had many decades to get everything right and managed to do almost everything wrong, but I have now. I have you and Emma now, and I'll do the best I can with the time I have left. You still have plenty of time. Maybe, maybe not. Nobody knows. But the time I do have, I want to spend it with you. If you'll let me, I'll let you. We'll let you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the slowly darkening sky. "Hey, Grandpa," Daniel said eventually, using the word naturally now, without hesitation. "Yes? Do you think we'll be okay? All of us?" Edward thought carefully about the question. "I think we'll have hard days. I think we'll disagree sometimes. I think old wounds will resurface occasionally. But yes, I think we'll be okay. Because we're trying. And sometimes trying is enough." Daniel smiled. "Yeah, sometimes trying is enough." From the bedroom, Emma began to cry softly. The two men stood up automatically. Daniel went in first, but Edward followed. Together they soothed the baby, working in sync, born of 3 months of practice. And there, in that warm room as spring finally came to Alaska, 3 generations were together. Not perfect, not without scars, but together, trying, building something new on the ruins of what was broken. The blizzard had brought death and pain, but it had also brought, in an unexpected and miraculous way, a second chance. An opportunity to do better, to be better. And Edward Callahan, the reclusive businessman who had spent so much time alone in his mountain mansion, finally understood what Eleanor had tried to teach him so many years ago, that family isn't perfection, it's presence, it's showing up, it's trying, failing, and trying again, it's forgiveness, it's patience, it's love that chooses to stay even when it would be easier to walk away. And for the first time in decades, Edward didn't feel alone. He had a family, imperfect, mended, full of complicated stories, but real as the weight of Emma in his arms, as real as Daniel's hesitant but genuine smile. The snow had melted, spring had come, and with it, the possibility of new beginnings. Did this story touch you? Do you believe in second chances and the power of forgiveness? Leave a comment below if you've ever been through a similar family reunion. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single narrative, and share this video with someone who needs to believe it's never too late to rebuild bonds. Sometimes, the hardest storms in life take us exactly where we need to be. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next story.